Hello everybody, Darren here from Republic of Play, and today we're going to be looking at the Imperator Rome 1.2 Cicero update. That's right, it's no longer in beta, and the question on a lot of players' minds right now is it fixed? Is it time to come back to Imperator Rome, and are the big problems some people had with the game solved? In this video I'm going to review every new major feature and discuss how it plays and affects the broader game, as well as touch on some of its shortcomings. So let's begin. The first major change is the removal of mana. The 4 power resources that dictated almost every facet of the game have been removed and reworked into something called political influence. Political influence is generated based on the loyalty of your characters who hold office, so now keeping your core government loyal to you will yield you more power to do things with. This influence is used for several things. It's used for diplomatic actions such as fabricating claims and improving opinion. It's used to change laws and ideas, to increase your stability, enable government interactions, change governor policies, develop cities, and to handle political events. So it does quite a lot. So far though, it plays much better than the previous power system. The old system earned you power based on your ruler's traits, something that you had very little control over. But now, influence is a direct result as to how you've managed your characters in office. On top of that, the more corrupt your ruler is, the less influence you get out of the government in total, which is a really nice trade-off. Corruption as a ruler is something that builds up when you're taking shortcuts and making life easier for yourself. Maybe you want to bribe someone for their loyalty or ignore certain political events. Then you'll become more corrupt, which basically stays with your ruler for their entire reign. It's a great trade-off mechanic where short-term gain means long-term loss, and managing that is extremely rewarding and fun. The next major change is province development. Previously, all of the little regions in Imperator Rome were called cities, and were essentially all pretty similar. They all had the same buildings and didn't have that many options to influence them. Now, in 1.2, they're all called settlements, and a settlement can progress to become a city, and a city can progress to become a metropolis. Settlements can only have one building, and they have 6 unique ones to choose from. This allows you to specialize the settlement to do a certain job or to support cities within the wider province. A settlement with grain, for instance, can have a farm built on it, allowing for greater production of food, which in turn supports higher populations for the entire province. Any settlement can be turned into a city with gold and political influence. This will then increase its population capacity and provide new unique buildings to allow you to specialize the city for different things. If you grow the city beyond 80 pops, you can then turn it into a metropolis, which is an expensive investment but further boosts the capabilities of the city in the long term with more capacity and trade routes. On top of this, you can now invest in 4 different categories for the entire province: military, civic, oratory, and religious. Each of these costs political influence and takes 2 years to complete, but it allows you to increase your output, your building slots, your trade routes, and your happiness, which effectively means you can play tall, constantly reinvesting into these categories as there is no limit to them. So because of these changes to province development, there's really no limit as to what settlement you pick on the map to be your next big metropolis. It just takes time, money, and influence, but you can now build more strategic provinces that make use of the resources around them. A good province will make use of food-producing settlements to support larger cities, while further investing in its own development to support itself in the long term. It's far more engaging and nuanced than how it worked previously. The next major change is pop mechanics. Pops will now promote class, assimilate culture, convert religion, and migrate to and from cities all by themselves. Unlike previously, there's no magic conversion buttons, and you can't force relocate a pop unless they are a slave. Instead, now things happen over time based on how you influence the city. The new buildings at your disposal essentially affect every aspect of a pop. Certain buildings will get more out of a certain class of pop, others will change the rate at which they promote, assimilate, or convert, and others will affect migration and the capacity of the city. So this gives you the freedom to build the cities that you want to build. If you want to build a bustling trade hub, you'll build libraries and academies, which increases the amount of citizens. Citizens are the ones that do commerce, so you might want to build some aqueducts to facilitate a lot more of them, and build some marketplaces to capitalize on that commerce that they earn. Building the city on a port will then further boost the commerce, and maybe using a governor policy to encourage trade will bump it even further. So you can see how, even though it would take some time, maybe 10 years or so, you can transform a city entirely. If you need to refocus on it to be manpower, you can do that by changing the ideals, and the citizens would demote to manpower producing freemen. This also ties into the removal of mana. You're now rewarded much more for long-term planning. You can't just instantly fix an area when you get into it, you gotta work at it like a project. It can be tricky when you start off. Some places simply won't convert due to their happiness and unrest, and you'll have to invest a lot in pacifying the area, increasing the loyalty, and keeping it happy. Only then will religion start to take hold and eventually culture. It also just feels much more organic and realistic to see the gradual change in a province over the course of 10 to 20 years. It makes the world feel much more alive. The final major change I want to talk about is the rework of the military tradition tree. With the removal of the martial power resource, they've added something called military experience. Much like political influence, military experience is now the sum total of the average unit or cohort's experience across your empire. So now, instead of an uncontrollable ticking resource, your armies directly impact military experience. If you're fighting battles, you'll be gaining experience faster, but if you want to remain peaceful, you can still raise armies and drill them to keep their experience high. Then technologies, laws, and trade goods that reduce experience decay become much more valuable, as now not only does it help with wars, but it also helps with your military tradition tree. It's again a much more practical use of an abstract resource because what you actually do in the world affects it. So that's it for the major changes to the game. There is of course a bunch of more minor changes and balance changes too. There's now new laws, technologies, and events specific to certain governments and nations. There was also the 1.1 update, which changed how stability worked, added more character depth, overhauled navies, and diversified religions, so the game is in a dramatically better state than it was on release. But it's not without fault. It still has some major issues, which we're going to get into in just a moment. Essentially, I think now the core gameplay has largely been fixed or at least vastly improved and is quite enjoyable to play. However, there's still a big elephant in the room when it comes to a game this wide and expansive, and it's that everything sort of feels the same. There's a few things that on their own don't necessarily seem that bad, but when compounded together build up to create a more placeholder feel to the game. Take this for instance, every settlement looks the same in its UI, so we have a situation where the hills of Ireland look the same as the hills in Arabia. I still think more terrain types to distinguish this climate could be used here to create some variation. Desert hills, green hills, coastal terrain, things like that, and so on. There's no unique buildings for nations, instead they all utilize the same buildings and you don't have to really rethink your strategy, even if you're in different parts of the world with different governments and cultures. The fact that all settlements build the same is just a little bit dull. For instance, the theater building is a culture building, and the temple is a religious one. Why not have these unique to their culture or their religion and do different things? Cultures could even have one or two of their own unique buildings. Instead, right now, everything's the same for everyone. There's no unique units for nations, instead the game just deals with unit types such as heavy infantry or heavy cavalry. Then your military traditions provide buffs in different categories to differentiate you from your enemies. I can see what they're going for, but I do think it would just be a little bit more fun if we had actual units and unique ones tied to certain provinces and regions. For instance, if Rome were to conquer Greece, perhaps if the culture remained at least 50% Greek or something like that, then you could recruit hoplites or something else. Then there'd be a trade-off to keeping the population Greek but gaining military diversity. Right now, there's absolutely none of that. Governments for countries, while they do have 3 different types, all share some commonality, such as having 8 offices to manage. To me it seems a bit odd that a republic such as Athens manages 8 offices just like a monarchy does, like Sparta. While their main government does operate different, the fact that this is the same for every country does seem a little bit boring. A nice potential trade-off for a republic, which generally has some nice benefits, will be to have much more people to manage, say maybe 10 or 12. Perhaps a monarchy would only need 6 positions in government to be run effectively. There's a lot you can do that would diversify the governments even within themselves. That's much more than just 8 offices. Moving on now to decisions. The decisions that can be enacted for a country are still extremely few and copy-pasted between different nations. For me, there should be far more of these in a much better UI. For instance, as the Bosporan Kingdom, I want to take the entire coastline of the Pontus Exodus, but there's nothing I can do to form a new empire around the completion of that. Similarly, if you conquer the entire Aegean Sea, you can't rename yourself to the Aegean Kingdom or something like that. There should be decisions all over the world for things like this, with specific conditions to be fulfilled. Maybe if you lived on several islands, you get bonuses to trade and commerce or navies and things like that. It's literally just a text document to edit these things in. It's pretty lightweight stuff. As the Bosporan Kingdom, I can only change my government type, change my religion, or reunite Alexander's empire in the decisions. First off, Changing government or religion should be in the government tab or the religion tab, with a clear UI as to what the changes will even do. I could change religion and I have no idea what the religion's benefit is, it doesn't tell me, or what their omens will be. How bad is that? It doesn't make any sense. The only way I could check is if I quit the game, start a new one with another country who has that religion, and see what they've got. Great UI. So the point of mentioning this diversity is that while they've greatly improved the core of the game, I still think it's only good for a handful of playthroughs because it does get quite repetitive, even with different nations. However, their next update is focusing on diversity and unique nations, and also DLC, so hopefully they'll take on some of the things I'd like to see if people agree with it. I do feel like unique units and buildings is the way to go. So let's talk about how the game actually plays right now, in general. Overall, for a first campaign, it's quite good. The AI has gotten a little bit more aggressive and definitely seem to try and pick you apart when you're weakened after a war. For some reason, they all just use the neutral stance in diplomacy and they still make pretty stupid decisions, like letting a fleet sit out at sea, killing all the men on board. This doesn't happen often, but it does happen. Empires in general seem to be growing bigger than before and much less likely to collapse from civil war. It's actually at a really fun stage right now. An example I can think of is Thrace becoming quite large through rapid expansion early on in my campaign, but then they had a rebellion as they couldn't tame the culture. During the rebellion, Macedon attacked from behind and they lost everything. It was essentially the complete collapse of a major power within a year, which was very cool to see. On the other side of things, I've seen two powers forge into one, Parnia and Zathia. They formed Parthia, and suddenly two relatively minor nations became a behemoth of a great power in the east. That was also very cool, although I think it might be kind of semi-scripted that can happen. But either way, it was cool to see. In some aspects, though, the game can still feel a little bit early access. For instance, when capturing a port with a ship, or doing a slave raid or port assault, there's no sounds, there's no messages, it's just an instant action. But there are sounds for every other action, so it's just a bit inconsistent and feels unfinished. There's no Metropolis message or alert when it's finished building, and no unique graphics on the map or image for it. Events can create characters that sort of break your family tree. They can tell you who their mother is, but they can't trace them back in the list of children. Buildings finish with just a blob of red text on screen saying it's complete, or when you steal pops, you get the same message. Not only does that look bad, it's actually quite hard to read too, and sometimes it's kind of important to know where those pops have gone. When a war ends that you may have even been taking part in, there's no sound or peace deal to view. You just have to read the map and figure out who got what. Oh, and there is a little red blob of text again that says peace, of course. As I said before with the diversity thing, each one of these on their own may not seem like much, but it does add up over time to make you feel like you're playing something that's just not finished. This was something I never felt was the case with playing Stellaris or Hearts of Iron, for instance. So, there's two things I want to touch on regarding current gameplay mechanics that aren't working quite right in my mind. The first thing is characters and their power. Characters now have a power base, which builds up based on the jobs that they have. So a governor with a big governorship will start to build up a lot of power, and building up that power will slowly erode at their own loyalty over time. Similar things happen for generals with a lot of loyal cohorts, or characters with a lot of money. It's a decent system that essentially means people who become powerful begin to question the ruler over time and become a little bit more disloyal. The disloyal characters in your country cannot share more than 25% of the power generated by everyone. If the combined power of these disloyal characters reaches more than that 25% threshold, then a ticking timer for a civil war will begin. It sounds pretty good, okay? And it is pretty good. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible to have happen, and there's a few reasons for this. The first is with governors. Governors gain power based on their governorship size, but when they become disloyal, they often raise an army. In doing so, they forfeit their governorship and lose their power, thus becoming irrelevant and actually gaining their own loyalty back. The second is with paying off the disloyal characters. When a character does raise an army, say in a secession crisis, they raise 20 or so cohorts loyal to them. This gives them even more power than they had before. However, if you bribe the character to get them over 33% loyalty, then their army often stops being loyal to them instantly. Without the loyal cohorts, they lose their power, and they start naturally just becoming loyal again. Before you know it, them and the army are gone. So there's just a few instances of that happening where in various campaigns it seems like I'm gonna have a real problem here, gotta figure it out, have to pay off their troops, maybe run a trial on the character or something like that. but it never quite works out, and the problem seems to almost always solve itself, or it's just like a one-click solution with a bribe. It's almost good. It's like really close to it. Just needs a little bit more work to actually test how you can get to the point of civil war. Now, I'm sure if you let a lot of people's loyalty slip, then maybe it becomes a bit of an issue. But for me, it's just been really easy to solve, and I've played a few campaigns with it now. The second gameplay item that's a bit lackluster is trade. Trade is still an instant agreement between two nations to transfer a resource. It doesn't travel from point A to point B, it's just an instant delivery. You could have a nation completely isolated and surrounded by someone who is at war, still delivering their goods outside of it. It's just a really boring system. It becomes slightly more interesting now that food resources actually help food in provinces, but the way the game is balanced right now, you pretty much never run out. Now, if you try to play tall, it can cause a greater effect though, as you'll probably start relying on importing food if you're just like a city-state or a very small nation. I've mentioned it ad nauseum by now, but I do feel trade needs to somewhat travel on routes. This would allow trade to be actually interrupted by wars or by pirates, and maybe could provide little commerce benefits based on the routes it takes. I don't think they should be preset routes like in EU4, maybe something more like custom routes like in Stellaris, where you can actually build your own trade nodes to send trade off out of. I think trade goods just in general should be more useful rather than just modifiers. I would love if you could import something like leather, allowing you to build a tannery building, or combining multiple resources such as precious metals and gemstones to make something like a jeweler's, and maybe that would affect citizens. Cloth and dyes could allow you to create a textile workshop. Once the buildings are built, maybe they'll operate less efficiently if you lose that resource. I'd love that sort of system where keeping up trade between empires actually matters. So that's essentially it for the 1.2 update to Imperator. Definitely a big step in the right direction. I was watching my original review and I'm amazed at how much they were actually able to fix. I really never thought that they'd remove the 4 mana powers because it had a hand in all aspects of the game. So to recap, the game has seen huge improvements and the core loop is greatly improved. They need to add some unique flavor now to the different countries and then polish up some of the current systems. Then I think it'll really be the game that the community sort of expected it to be. As of right now, the game is good for a few campaigns and maybe some multiplayer fun. The first DLC is coming with the next update. That's going to be a pretty big DLC to see kind of how they handle that. As always, if you enjoy Imperator content, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Consider supporting on Patreon, which is a great way to directly support the content and also get some benefits. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.